Residence is a fully 3D cinematic film made primarily in Blender. The overarching goal of the film was to reflect on my own artistic journey and to present a well-crafted narration representing human autonomy and agency. This project took a considerable amount of time and effort due to the degree of difficulty and number of time-consuming processes in the pre-production, production, and post-production stages. Before beginning production, I used Pinterest and YouTube to help brainstorm ideas and gather possible references. Afterwards, I created a visual presentation of my initial ideas, which I used to receive early feedback. I also got people to fill out a feedback sheet, which gave me valuable insight on how my project was perceived by others and what I could do to improve it. I then went straight on to writing the script in Studio Binder, and trying to include a variety of scenes and environments. I then moved on to storyboarding, where each shot was hand-drawn and digitally scanned. Afterwards, I began drafting mood boards using PureRef. I primarily took inspiration from YouTube, Pinterest, and ArtStation. I then created a list of props using Notion, where I also used it to set goals and deadlines throughout the lifespan of my project. I also made sure to back up and organize my files and images using Google Drive, which not only allowed me to use them across multiple devices, but also reduced the risk of data loss. For the first 9 weeks of pre-production, I worked on a few personal projects. These range from video editing using After Effects and 3D modeling and texturing in Blender or Autodesk Revit. I began by modeling some simple props to include in my scenes, where I experimented with using both subdivision and mesh modeling processes, using the Boolean, mirror, solidify, and array modifiers to aid in this process. I also practiced some animation and node-based workflows, where I experimented with burn rigging, weight painting, and the use of geometry nodes. Here I created a plant growth simulation following Chex's tutorial on how to make blooming roses, and here are some older simulations. During the first holidays, I visited the National Gallery of Victoria, where I took some high-quality photos of some artworks on exhibit. I also took other photos of wet concrete and dirt, as well as some reference photos to use for texturing later down the line. Afterwards, working on my first environment where I continued experimenting with node-based workflows, creating some realistic trees with the aid of the plugin mtree. This allowed me to customize the displacement, normal, and roughness maps to create realistic textures that was overall a much better option compared to Blender's building sampling generator. I began shifting my focus onto Photoshop, where I began making mock-up newsletter designs. Here I utilized my skills in graphic design and image editing, using a variety of blending styles, camera settings, and paper textures to create an authentic vintage look. Not long after, I began working on one of the hardest and most time-consuming and challenging models, a grand piano. I used a variety of references which I accessed online, including this blueprint I found on Pinterest. I also used personally taken reference photos to achieve the highest level of fidelity. I modeled the entire piano from scratch, ensuring that I had clean topology throughout. This would later reduce render times and also reduce the strain pulled on my PC. I designed a few architectural models using Autodesk Revit to use in my environments. Unlike Blender, Autodesk Revit specialized in architectural design, which made it much easier to work with. I began texturing most of my props, where I primarily used PBR and procedurally created textures using geometry nodes. For some props, such as buildings and complicated models, I used UV mapped images to texture buildings, boxes, posters, and other props. I then began working on some simulations, primarily using Blender's Coarse modifier, where I used wind forces to simulate realistic movements. I also used the particle system to generate random instances of dust particles, which I later animated to float around. I began to model my characters, where I took real-life reference photos to use as a guide for proportions. Afterwards, I used Blender to block out each character, where I then used subdivision modifiers to create geometry. Afterwards, I used the mirror modifier to complete the body, and began manually retopologizing the character. For this, I used single vertex snapping enabled to manually define the shape of the body. I also began rigging my characters, where I used traditional burn rigging methods to parent controllers to the joints of my characters, and also used constraints for basic objects and simulations. After setting up my rig, I encountered an issue where some of my burns were influencing other parts of my mesh, so I had to manually change the influence of each burn through weight painting. This helped to prevent multiple burns from moving parts of my character. I finished rigging my characters and began animating them using keyframes. For this, I shot reference videos which allowed me to capture realistic and customized motion for my project. In particular, I shot reference videos for some first-person shots and my walk cycle animations. I then went straight into rendering, where I used these settings. I made sure to enable persistent data for faster render times and took several test renders before rendering the final shot at full resolution. I also began learning the composition for the piece What Could Have Been from the series Arcane. For this, I decided that the most efficient course of action was to purchase an existing composition to perform a cover on, where I chose Grimcat's Piano's version. I made sure to follow the proper process for licensing and usage, where I asked for permission from both the original IP owner, Riot Games, and Grimcat Piano himself. I also began recording sound effects to use in my film, where these were recorded using the Rode Wireless Go 2 and my iPhone 13. I then transferred these sound effects into Audacity and After Effects, where I then edited these audio effects to sound more offending and used equalizers to balance out frequencies and improve overall sound quality. After completing some renders, I created a usable shot list in After Effects, where I used markers to sync the sequence to the soundtrack before actually importing footage. This allowed me to sketch a rough sequence of events based on my storyboard and helped me determine how my film would look with music. After sequencing my footage, I then moved on to compositing, where I used a variety of effects and adjustment layers to add color grade, visual effects, text, and realism to my footage. Quality control was maintained throughout the entire span of my project, where I collected feedback from a variety of sources, including from my friends, teachers, industry professionals, and university graduates. I was in contact with some professional studios and creative graduates or students from the Academy of Interactive Entertainment at the University of Technology, Sydney. When modeling my grand piano, I took feedback from an AIE Games artist graduate who helped point out some flaws in my topology. After completing a basic model, I sent them a time lapse and a few screenshots of the topology.
It looks good, but you should really clean up your topology. You should join the verts and maintain quads. Also, avoid ingons.
I implemented their advice where I reduced the number of polycounts used in the model, and it also gave me insight into what to look out for my future models. Throughout the course of my project, I also received extensive feedback from one of my friends, Arish, a previous shape learner, who suggested a range of recommendations throughout my production process, including comments on framing, lighting, and animation. I was able to come up with ideas with his help, which I believe greatly enhanced the ambience of my project.
Yo, that looks pretty good. You could potentially move the pole a bit closer to the camera, maybe add a rack focus. Also, you can add some volumetric fog in the back to add some ambience.
Also took feedback from my peers, where we used a group chat on Discord to frequently update and receive feedback on our projects. I also had private conversations with family members, some classmates, and my multimedia teacher throughout all stages of my project.
I'd say pretty good so far. But if you're going for some extra realism, then you may need to start beveling your edges down a little bit more.
Throughout my project, I kept outsourcing to a minimum, where I considered 3 key factors. Is it too difficult or time-consuming to produce myself? Is it essential to my film or can I adapt it? And finally, is it ethical? I used high-quality HDRIs for most of my environments to enhance realism. However, this was minimized as I used artificial lighting for all interior shots. Some sound effects, including these police sirens and rises, were outsourced as they were either too difficult to reproduce myself or realistically unachievable given my time constraints. I later edited these sounds in Audacity and After Effects.